Hello everybody, hope you're doing well and thanks for joining us for another video. Now, a few months back, I did a series of live streams that were discussing the moon landings with former flat earther Jiren Campanella, who runs the channel Jirenism. Now, for almost a decade, Jiren was not only convinced that the Earth was flat, but then that by extension, the moon landings were fake. So, after he'd managed to break the mental block of flat Earth, I suggested that he and I should do some streams together going over the moon landings, where I invited him to bring up any and all arguments that he or his audience had for the moon landings being faked, and I would attempt to refute them. Now, we wound up doing about 4 separate streams that totaled some 14 hours, in which we talked about a vast range of different aspects. However, by the end of it, Jiren did shift his stance on it. I had a poll running, I'll end that now, that said, do you think Jiren will conclude the moon landings were real? I've got 56% say you will conclude they were real and 44% say no. So, who are you disappointing, Jiren? Cards on the table.
Yeah, no, I think that I would say that it looks like we went to the moon. So, take it as you will, take it or leave it. I don't think that I have the evidence anymore. So, I do think it's important to bring evidence if you're going to make a claim. And not that I've never felt that way before, but I do think it's more important now.
And I think a lot of it comes down to the analysis that I did of the Apollo footage. I mean, I spent hours combing through Apollo video and thousands of photographs in preparation for these discussions. But actually, I really enjoyed it. I found it very fascinating because I was often picking up on these little details that I'd not fully understood before. It's very much like when I use brilliant.org. It's very aptly named because it's a brilliant way to learn online about hundreds of topics across maths, science, and computing. Each course starts with the basics and gradually builds up to more complex classes, and you can jump ahead to any part you feel like, so there is something for everybody. And the reason that I love Brilliant so much is their use of interactive animations, which I find makes it much easier to visualize and understand concepts. And when I say I love Brilliant, I've done classes on Brilliant every single day without fail for almost 900 consecutive days, having completed almost 1,200 lessons. To learn for free on Brilliant, go to brilliant.org/Dave McKeegan, scan the QR code on screen, or click the link in the description. And Brilliant is also giving viewers 20% off the annual subscription that gives you unlimited access to everything on Brilliant. Jiren fully appreciated that you can't really just say, it was fake. There needs to be a valid explanation for how it would have been faked. And before the streams, he'd been very vocal about the idea of it all being faked in a studio. And some of the key areas as to why he thought this was, firstly, the apparent lack of footage whilst the rover was being driven.
This is the one view, and people who watch my show know that I show this all the time. It's only 3 minutes. And even in this 3-minute section, you can see that, as I'll show McKeegan, this mountain back here never changes. I could take a screenshot right now, and then let the cart drive for a while, and then if I take a screenshot again, the background never changes because this is a sheet. It's not real. I think that they could have cleaned up a lot of stuff since then, and I think that they have, and I think I can show that as part of my evidence. I think Apollo 15 shows that the moon rover thing is fabricated, and then in 16 and 17, they no longer filmed from the rover. So you can't even find any film of that, which...
Now, the rover was only used on the later missions, Apollos 15, 16, and 17, and the purpose of it was to allow the astronauts to cover more ground during their time on the surface. They never ventured too far from the lunar module, though. They always stayed within walking distance in case the rover ever stopped working. They wouldn't then be left stranded. On each EVA, they would drive out to the farthest planned location, collect some samples and such, and then they could stop at multiple sites on the return. And having the rover also allowed them to carry more equipment and collect more samples than if they were just walking everywhere. And fitted onto the rover was a TV camera. And if you search on YouTube for, say, Apollo 15 EVA, or 16 or 17, you will find hours of the TV broadcast footage from that lunar rover camera, including these great clips that I found from Apollo 16, such as the camera being panned around and then tilted up to view the Earth, This one, where both astronauts are moving around in front of the camera.
Get that dust out of there. We'll never get the mags.
Whilst we can clearly see the reflections in their visor of the scenery that's behind the camera, and it doesn't look like a studio. Or this clip where an astronaut throws one of the fabric covers and we can see how little of an arm movement is needed to be able to throw that cover a very long way due to the weaker gravity of the moon. And that fabric is moving around, so it's clearly fabric, not rigid, but it's also not being dragged back like we would see if you throw anything like that on Earth where there's an atmosphere. But the camera is only ever on when they're at a particular site. Whenever they finish at a location, the footage jumps to the next stop, with apparently no footage of the rover being driven apart from one short clip that Jiren had found. And he was convinced that this pointed to it being faked in a studio, and that the one clip he had, which was from Apollo 15, didn't show any parallax of the distant objects, which would also point to it being projected onto a studio wall.
And even in this 3-minute section, you can see that, as I'll show McKeegan, this mountain back here never changes. I could take a screenshot right now and then let the cart drive for a while. And then if I take a screenshot again, the background never changes because this is a sheet. It's not real.
And by parallax, I mean if you take a photograph of a group of objects and then you move a few steps to the side and take another photograph, the change in perspective will cause a noticeable shift between those objects at various distances. The shift of nearby objects will be much more noticeable than further objects. Further objects require a much bigger shift in perspective to become noticeable. And Jiren thought that the reason there was only one short clip covering a relatively short distance was to hide the studio. Because if they had a clip of it driving further, it would have caused more of a parallax shift to the distant mountains, which you couldn't fake in a studio. Now, in reality, there is actually more than just that one clip of the rover being driven. There's this long clip from Apollo 16, for example, that I showed him. However, the issue is that the TV camera was not only providing a live feed back to Earth, but it was being operated remotely by one of the controllers in Houston. All done via a directional antenna on the rover, and it was a TV broadcast camera, so it had no internal tapes to record any footage. All the footage had to be saved by recorders back on Earth as the feed was coming through. And the dish had to be hand moved and precisely pointed at the Earth in order for the feed to make it back to be recorded. So once the rover began moving, the antenna would no longer be pointing at Earth and thus no footage would ever get back to be recorded. It even details in the documentation for the rover that the TV camera could not be used whilst the rover was being driven. Well, I say no footage. There is actually a very small segment of video that I found which was captured as the rover begun moving. This, I believe, was after the final EVA of Apollo 17, where the rover was being relocated to a far distance away from the lunar module in order to record the liftoff. The pan of the camera at liftoff was being done by operators back in Houston, but I have this separate video that details all of that. And I also found this photograph, which was taken after this point, looking back at the lunar module with the rover in the background ready to capture the liftoff. And another interesting clip I found from this period of Apollo 17 is once they'd got the rover parked up, the astronauts are finishing their closeout whilst the camera is continuing to pan around and view the landscape, even zooming in and out on the lunar module, to give you an idea of just how far away the thing is parked. And then after a few minutes, we see the astronauts hopping off into the distance to get back on board the lunar module and then prepare for liftoff. Anyway, the videos that we instead see from the rover whilst it's being driven are typically coming from the 16mm data camera that they had, which was positioned between the two astronauts. This was more like a camcorder than a TV camera. It had its own film magazines fitted to it that allowed it to record video directly without any links back to Earth. Plus, whilst on Apollo 11 there was only one Hasselblad photo camera that was used on the surface, for all of the remaining missions the astronauts carried one each. And it seems that quite regularly they would take photographs whilst driving. presumably to give geologists back on Earth a better view of the lunar landscape. And on more than one occasion, these photographs would be a sequence shot over an extended period of time. And one such sequence that caught my eye, again, was from Apollo 16, on Film Magazine 117. Starting at photo 18731, the sequence runs for 70 photographs until photo 18800. Now, firstly, what I found interesting about these is the sequence ends with them getting back to the lunar module. And you can see the lunar module comes into view, firstly in photo 18794, where it's actually half obscured by the terrain, and then we can see it get noticeably larger as they approach it. However, 18794 also piqued my interest even more, because whilst I was scrolling through the other photos from Apollo 16, I came across another sequence of photographs during a rover drive. These were on magazine 116, starting at photo 18672 and finishing at photo 18680. So only 8 photos this time, and these appear to have a smudge in the middle of them. Possibly something either on the lens or the resu plate inside the camera. But these also show them returning to the lunar module. And at first I thought these were from 2 different EVAs, given that they'd done 3 EVAs in total. But then I noticed that whilst the sequence on magazine 117 has the TV camera in the middle of the frame, the ones from magazine 116 have the TV camera just in view on the right of the frame, whilst the antenna is visible on the left of frame that we don't see in the other sequence, which indicates that the sequence on magazine 117 was taken from an astronaut who was sat on the right-hand seat of the rover, whilst 116 was taken from the left-hand seat. And photos 18676 and 677 both show the lunar module visible and partly obscured, just like we see in 18794. And all of them showed the rover tracks in front of them because they were returning to the lunar module, so they were following their tracks back to it. And the tracks in both sets of photos show the same right-hand turn and the same mounds of regolith on the edges, which suggests that they were actually taken at the same time from near enough the same exact spot, but with the photos being taken from either side of the rover. This gives us a great opportunity to check for parallax, because it's basically like alternating back and forth between one eye and the other. To do this, I just overlay the photos, twist them so that they're aligned with each other, and then I select one part of the photo as an anchor point. So firstly, let's say this small rock on the far side of the tracks. If I align both photos to that particular rock, and I flick back and forth between them, you can see the twist in perspective between the photos. If I move the anchor point to align with one of the cluster of rocks a bit further away, you can again see the twisting. Same if we move it to the rocks a bit further away, same if we align it to the lunar module itself. And also crucially, the same shifting between the photos when we align them to the mountains in the background. And this is quite important because some people have suggested that they faked it in a studio and the scenery was some sort of a projector screen or just the wall of the studio itself. However, if that were the case, then the scenery would appear identical in both photographs. For example, if I take 2 photographs side by side here in my studio and I do the same alternating between them, if I align them to any of the objects in the foreground, we can see that same parallax rotation. But if I align it with the scenic photo that's on the wall behind me, the objects within the photo have no parallax shift. We don't see any more or less of the mountains way off in the distance behind the huts because they're all on one single plane. They would have to be layered in a 3-dimensional space for us to see any parallax shift. But we can take this a step further, because in photograph 18795, we can see this region of lighter coloured surface way off in the distance, which isn't an anomaly in this photo because it also shows up in a few other ones, including much earlier in the sequence in photo 18765. And if we align these to the mountain peak way off in the distance and we flick between them, we can see an even clearer parallax shift between the mountains. So, seeing parallax shift in the scenery of the moon photos is clear evidence that the scenery is not some sort of projection. And I showed something similar to this to Jiren, but it was an example I found on Apollo 15, a mission which landed in a region of the moon called Hadley Rill, near the Apennine Mountains. They also did 3 EVAs on the lunar surface there as well. EVAs 1 and 3 travelled to the edges of Hadley Valley, however EVA 2 travelled up the side of the Apennine front, which gave them an elevated view across the whole valley. And it appears they actually had 3 separate stops in this region: Station 6, Station 6A and Station 7, each a few hundred metres across from each other, which means any views taken looking across the valley would therefore be a great test of parallax in the distance. Now, they took panoramas at each location looking across the valley, and I found one image from each panorama set aimed at the same region. AS 1585 11486 taken at Station 6, AS 1590 12184 taken at Station 6A, and AS 1590 12206 taken at Station 7. And overlaying all 3 of them, centered on this small crater off in the distance, we can toggle between them and again see a change in perspective. Shifting the anchor point to the cluster of rocks further away, we see the same again. But if I anchor all 3 frames on the mountain in the distance, we can see a shift in perspective, with the central peak becoming more visible from behind the big mountain as the vantage point moves to the left. Another clear indicator that this is not shot in some studio, but instead is looking across a vast region. But now, to wrap up with my favourite part. Because on later Apollo missions, they not only had a pair of Hasselblad cameras each fitted with a 60mm lens, but they also carried a third Hasselblad camera fitted with a 500mm telephoto lens to allow them to get detailed views of the scenery from further away rather than needing to travel to everything. And I was curious if from any of these locations up the Apennine front, because they were in an elevated position with a clear view across the valley, whether they could see the lunar module at the landing site or not. And it turns out, not only could they see it, but at Station 6, Dave Scott used the 500mm camera to get some shots of it. AS 1584 11324 and 325 both show a clear view of the lunar module way off in the distance. Not only that, but I took these photographs and I was able to overlay them onto the wide view shot 11486 from Station 6, shrink the 500mm shot down, and aligned it into the wide view shot to see exactly where the lunar module was. And not only can we figure out that this small mark in photo 11486 is in fact the lunar module, but the rocks and the terrain perfectly match between the 2 photographs as well. Not only that, but the whole time that this was happening, they had the TV camera on the rover filming them. And we can see the landscape off in the distance, and we can see Dave Scott with the 500mm camera taking these photographs, and even a conversation between him and one of the controllers back on Earth about the fact that he's photographed the lunar module.
I took about 4 more pictures on the 500, Joe, looking out at the Silver Spur and the blocks that are exposed up there.
Okay, Dave, out of curiosity, did you photograph the limb with the big camera?
Oh, how did you guess, Joe?
Seems pretty impossible to fake that in a studio. However, I am going to bring up one last set of examples that I showed Jiren as well that I think really drove the point home. Because in our first stream, I showed him the rover footage from Apollo 16 that you saw earlier, and Jiren initially thought it looked suspicious due to what he described as the small rocks in the distance not really showing any parallax.
Very actually, see how this rock passed that one behind it. Any rock in front's going to pass the ones behind it. Now look at the backdrop, and you'll notice that nothing over here will ever shift. There's no shifting of anything in the backdrop. These 2 rocks will stay the same distance at the same place. All this looks like a completely different world. This is moving real, and then this back here, to me, looks like a sheet because nothing ever changed. Look at the parallax will stay the same. These distances of these 3 rocks will stay the same. So to me, if they're far enough to not have parallax, then they're so far away and you wouldn't even be able to see the rocks. Like the fact that you can see a rock, this is a rock and this is a rock, tells me it's close enough that you would see parallax. This rock needs to come in front of that back one, but it doesn't. It's going to stay right there, see?
Except I had to highlight to him that he was presuming that they're small rocks relatively close by rather than large rocks farther away, in which case you wouldn't see as much parallax. You have that atmospheric haze that kind of subconsciously gives you a clue as to how far away something is to, is it really far, is it quite close? I noticed...
But should you see a rock at, you wouldn't see a rock at a half mile.
But that's right. So this is where the problem lies, and this is kind of where you've got to reset your head and think, is it a rock or is it a giant boulder that is just far away that it looks like
Good call.
it's...
Yeah, you don't know.
And initially this seemed to throw Jiren a little bit. I think he saw it that it was basically impossible to disprove the moon landings because there was always this get out of jail free card excuse of, oh, we don't see parallax because everything's just really far away. Much further away than these ones here.
Right, and they're so far away that we can't see rocks on them. Right, like you wouldn't be able to see a little rock, but on the moon, we were seeing rocks on those side hills. Now you're saying they could be boulders.
Well, that's the thing, is that's the problem, is the case of...
So do you see what I'm saying, how far... But do you see what I'm saying, though, that then it's impossible to prove that they didn't go to the moon? Because if something like what I'm saying is legit, but the answer to it is, well, we don't know if they're rocks or if they're boulders, then you would never know. So that's what I'm saying. Maybe it's better just to give up the fruitless pursuit, because you're never going to say something that makes people go, oh, you're right, because they can always replace it with, well, you don't know what you're looking at. Well, you don't know how high that is. Well, you don't know what it looks like on the moon. So really, it's just a matter of you have to believe it or don't, but don't expect to ever, prove it.
The problem to bear in mind here is that on Earth, for starters, we're looking through an atmosphere. So we subconsciously know objects near to us look very clear, but that far off distances, the haze of the atmosphere will make objects look softer. But on the moon, there's no atmosphere, so that isn't the case. And Jiren and I sort of experienced this whilst we were in Antarctica together in December. Because there, the elevation was very high, so the air was naturally quite thin to begin with, but there was also next to no humidity. So I was able to take photographs like this of mountains with incredible levels of detail, and yet the mountains were actually about 12 kilometers away. But they didn't seem like it to us. They looked close enough that we could have just walked to them very easily due to how clear they looked. And also, typically, we're used to having other objects in view that can give us a reference to gauge sizes with. But on the moon, it's all just rocks of indeterminate sizes. So you never really know at first glance if you're viewing something that's really small quite close or something really big that's far away. And I think the example we just looked at with the lunar module in the distance highlights that, but there's 2 other examples I showed Jiren. One was a sequence of photographs taken from on board the rover whilst it was driving between stations. And if we look at this photograph from the sequence, for example, we can see these rocks in the distance, and as far as we could tell, these rocks could just be pretty small and only a few meters away. However, when you play the sequence through, you notice those rocks getting larger and larger and larger, until eventually the rover actually stops next to them and you realize the main rock is taller than a person. And once again, we can overlay the photos to show that they are the same rocks. In fact, I even scaled all of the photos down so that the rocks stayed the same size, and I could toggle between the layers to show that there is that same rotation as the observer's perspective changes. And finally, I then showed him this footage from Apollo 16, where we see the astronauts gathering up their equipment from the rover and then heading away towards what looks like a boulder that's probably about the same height as them, maybe a little bit bigger. And that probably about here, they're halfway there already. But as we let the footage play on, the astronauts just keep getting further and further away from the camera, only now actually getting to the halfway point to the rock.
That's about halfway, maybe.
And after they've stopped and collected a few rock samples, they carry on towards this big rock.
Hey, Tony, my guess is that most of these rocks around here are extremely shocked.
Like, tell me.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it looks like the battery's still
All these in this area look,
And now you're thinking, surely they've reached it. But they continue even further, and they actually drop down an embankment. By the time they finally reach it, you realize this rock is multiple times larger than them, and is actually an incredibly far distance from the camera. This rock, rather aptly named House Rock, I suspect due to its size. I'm not seeing how all of that is being done in a studio. But anyway, that's going to be it for this video. As always, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video and you haven't already done so, then please do consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons, and then hopefully we'll see you in the next video.